The ICU at Oak Creek Memorial breathed with the rhythm of machines that never slept. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical lullabies. Heart monitors traced their liquid patterns across screens that glowed like small fires in the dim hallway light. It was 6:22 a.m., and the morning shift was already running 3 beds behind. Katie Rodriguez moved through the unit like water finding its path, efficient, purposeful, leaving almost no trace. Her badge hung from a lanyard, and her scrubs, faded blue after 100 washings, carried the smell of institutional laundry and antiseptic. Her hands were the first thing anyone noticed. Not beautiful hands. Capable hands. The kind that had held pressure on wounds that shouldn't have survived and closed pores with the precision of someone who had learned under conditions where mistakes meant funerals. Scarred across the knuckles. 2 fingers on her left hand bent slightly wrong, evidence of a break that had healed without proper setting. She was 53 years old, though her face suggested a harder road. Grey at her temples caught the fluorescent light. Her eyes were the color of a storm Atlantic, not angry, but acquainted with weather. Nobody at Oak Creek Memorial knew that Katie Rodriguez had once been decorated by a 4-star general in a bunker whose location would never appear on any map. Nobody knew that she had spent 12 years moving through darkness with the kind of purpose that governments don't acknowledge. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knew the real reason her service jacket had simply vanished from official records in 2019, along with the woman who carried the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy. She was checking the 4 line on the patient in room for 11 when Dr. Sterling walked past, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that announced his arrival before his shadow did. He wore a white coat that looked like it had been tailored in Beverly Hills. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, 41 millimeters of surgical steel and gold, the kind that cost more than most nurses made in 6 months. He didn't glance at Katie. Men like Sterling never looked directly at nurses. They looked through them, past them, around them, everywhere except at the actual person keeping their patients alive. Room for 12 was at the end of the corridor, where the light seemed dimmer and the hum of the machines took on a different quality. Katie had been assigned the patient there during morning briefing. Navy SEAL. Trauma. Blind. No other details, which was unusual. Usually the charts came thick with history, medications, family contact information. This one was sparse. Redacted. She noticed these things the way other people notice smells in the air. She knocked once, a courtesy, and stepped inside. The man in the bed was 61 years old according to his chart, though his face suggested older. His skin had the texture of someone who had spent most of his life under sun that burned rather than nurtured. Scars traced maps across his shoulders and chest, old scars, the kind that had whitened and settled into the architecture of the body, becoming part of it. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything, and Katie understood immediately that wasn't a choice. His left eye was clouded white with scar tissue. His right eye might have been slightly better, but only slightly. A bandage covered the bridge of his nose. "Good morning," Katie said, and her voice was exactly what it always was, professional, measured, the voice of someone who had learned to deliver information without inflection. "I'm your nurse this shift. Katie. I'm going to check your vitals." The man's head turned toward her voice. Not his eyes. His head. The movement was small but precise, and something in that precision made Katie's breath catch in her throat, though her expression didn't change. "Commander Hayes," she said, reading from the chart. "That's correct," he said. His voice was quiet, rough, like a stone that had been worn smooth by running water. "And you're going to tell me your real name, or you're going to pretend we haven't met? Your choice." Katie's hands were steady as she reached for the blood pressure cuff. Steady as surgical steel. She'd been trained in 47 different ways to kill a man with her bare hands. She had extracted 17 people from a building in Haditha that was actively collapsing around them. She had held a 17-year-old boy in her arms as he died from a wound that shouldn't have been possible, listening to him apologize for bleeding on her uniform. She could certainly handle this moment. "Your pressure is running a little high," she said. "We'll monitor it." She wrapped the cuff around his upper arm with movements that were exact, economical. No wasted motion. 148/92. The blood pressure cuff hissed as it inflated, then released in a steady rhythm, and in that sound Katie heard something else entirely. She heard dust and distant explosions and the sound of her son's voice saying, "Tell him I tried, Mom. Tell him I tried." Marco had served under this man's command. March 2021, Anbar Province. The official report said it was an IED. The real story, the one Katie had eventually gathered through sources that didn't exist and conversations that had never happened, was more complicated. And now her son's commanding officer was blind in her hospital, dependent on her hands, and the universe was either very cruel or very just, and Katie had never been able to decide which. "I'm just your nurse," Katie said. "That's all you need to know." But her hands, as she took his pulse at the wrist, trembled almost invisibly. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of holding down something so large and pressing it so deep that nobody could see it moving under her skin. Commander Hayes's pulse was fast. Elevated. His heart rate on the monitor was running 94 beats per minute. The numbers told a story about pain and stress and a nervous system that hadn't yet learned how to exist in this new configuration of darkness. Katie made notes on his chart, neat, precise handwriting, the penmanship of someone trained to document with absolute accuracy. She was checking his medications when she first felt the weight of observation. It wasn't dramatic. It was the absence of distraction. Dr. Sterling stood at the nurse's station, 40 feet away, his shoulders angled toward her position, and he was watching. Not openly. Subtly. The way a predator watches a rival entering its territory, not hostile yet, just cataloguing the intruder's movements, looking for weakness. Katie continued her work. She reviewed the chart for medication interactions. She cross-referenced his lab results against the dosages he'd been prescribed. She made a note about his O2 saturation sitting at 93%, which was borderline. Not an emergency. But not ideal either. The kind of number that required attention in 12 hours if it didn't improve. She wrote it down anyway, because that's what Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez did. She noticed things, documented things, and solved problems before they became crises. Dr. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something in his jaw tightened. Katie saw it in the reflection of the monitor screen as she walked past the nurse's station. Just a moment. Just enough. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant frequency, a sound so constant that most people didn't hear it anymore. Katie heard it. She heard the ventilator in room 409 running slightly faster than its preset rhythm. She heard the shuffle of the attending physician's feet as he moved between patients. She heard the soft electronic beep of alarms that nobody was responding to yet. She heard the geography of this place the way she had once heard the geometry of a city at night, not just what was happening, but what was about to happen, where the danger was gathering, where someone would need saving. Her locker in the break room was the third one from the end, on the lower shelf of which sat a pair of combat boots. Not for show. Not a memory. The leather was cracked and faded from decades of actual use. The soles were worn at an angle from the way she naturally distributed her weight when moving at speed. There were still traces of dust in the laces, not regular dust, but the kind of dust that came from a specific building in a specific country, on a specific day that had been redacted from all official military records. She touched those boots sometimes when nobody was watching. Just a fingertip against the leather. A reminder that the person she had been was still real, even if she had to pretend that person had never existed. But that wasn't the worst part about being assigned to Commander Hayes, and Katie knew it the moment she read his name on the chart. The worst part was that this man had held her son while he died. Marco had been bleeding out, calling for his mother, and it had been Commander Hayes's hands pressing the wound, Commander Hayes's voice telling him that medical support was incoming, and Commander Hayes's presence that Marco had known in those final seconds. And now Katie was supposed to stand in that gap, to be the professional, to separate what she needed to feel from what she needed to do, and to save this man's life if saving his life became necessary. At 9:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling made his first phone call. Katie didn't know it yet. She wouldn't know it for hours. But something was already shifting. Something had already begun. The day continued. The machines kept their rhythm. Katie Rodriguez moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU with the quiet efficiency of someone who had no idea that her next 48 hours would change everything, or maybe everything was already in motion, and she was just finally catching up to her own fate. The machines kept their rhythm. Katie Rodriguez moved through room for 12 with the precise focus of someone checking a wound that wasn't healing the way it should. Commander Hayes lay still, his blind eyes tracking the sound of her voice as she narrated each movement, the antiseptic smell of the gauze, the soft hiss of her gloved hands working the dressing, the way she kept her touch deliberate and steady so he'd know exactly where she was in the room. His sister Amanda sat bedside in a folding chair, her eyes moving between the SEAL and the nurse with the kind of attention only family gives to someone broken. Katie was midway through assessing the suture line when the door opened behind her. "Nurse Rodriguez, step into the hallway." The voice came flat and cold, the way authority sounds when it's used as a weapon. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway in his white coat, his expression already shaped into something resembling disgust before she'd even turned to face him. Katie's hand stilled on the wound assessment. She didn't pause for dramatic effect, she simply finished her notation, made sure the dressing was secure, and then rose. She could feel Amanda's eyes on her back as she walked past the doctor and into the corridor. The hallway light was fluorescent and merciless. It made everything look surgical, which, Katie realized in the cold second before he spoke, was probably the point. "Your constant chart reviews are disrupting care flow." Dr. Sterling's voice carried through the open doorway, deliberately pitched to reach the room behind him. "You are a nurse, not a physician. Your job is to follow orders, not question them." Katie stood with her hands at her sides, her jaw clenched to the point where she could feel her molars bearing down. Her eyes met his and didn't waver. One steady breath in. One steady breath out. "I've been dismissed by better men than you, doctor," she said, her voice level as a held blade. And they had the courage to do it without an audience. The words landed the way she'd intended, quiet enough that only he could fully hear them, but loud enough that Amanda's sharp intake of breath came audible from the room. Dr. Sterling's face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw working as though he was calculating which direction to escalate. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again, but whatever he was about to say died somewhere between his brain and his lips, because Katie had already turned back toward room for 12 with the kind of finality that made it clear the conversation was over. She made it 3 steps before the tear came. It tracked down her left cheek with the inevitability of a single drop of rain finding a window. Katie felt it happen before she saw it happen, and in that millisecond of awareness, she made a choice. She didn't wipe it away frantically. She didn't try to hide it. She simply lifted her hand, wiped it away with the same deliberate motion she'd use on a patient's fever sweat, and turned to face Dr. Sterling one more time. Her eyes didn't break from his. Neither did they ask for mercy. Behind her, inside room for 12, Commander Hayes was still lying in the dark of his own making, listening to every word, understanding exactly what he'd just witnessed and understanding that he'd contributed to it by existing in this hospital, in this moment, bleeding and blind and waiting for a doctor who'd already decided the truth wasn't worth knowing. Dr. Sterling stepped back into the room without another word. Katie returned to her station and pulled up the charts. Her hands were steady. That was the thing people didn't understand about people trained to stay calm under fire. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was every muscle fiber screaming to do something and choosing not to. It was the difference between breaking and surviving. The next day, Katie entered the break room at 1,300 hours with her lunch in a paper bag. Linda and Rebecca were already at the corner table, the one with the view of the supply closet. They saw her come in. Made eye contact. And then, with the synchronized precision of people who'd been given instruction, they gathered their sandwiches and their coffee cups and migrated to the opposite side of the room like sharks responding to a signal. Katie sat alone. The sandwich remained untouched. She stared at the table's laminate surface and felt something shift inside her, not break, never break, but shift. The way a bone shifts when it's been fractured but hasn't yet been reset. She'd spent 3 years building a life where no one knew what she was. She'd become the quiet nurse, the competent one, the reliable hand in a crisis. And all of that had meant nothing to Dr. Sterling except as a threat to be neutralized. Thursday morning came gray and cold, the way San Diego mornings sometimes do when the Santa Ana winds are sleeping and the Marine layer isn't sure whether to stay or leave. Katie arrived for her shift at 6:05 and found the unit board posted with a notice in Dr. Sterling's handwriting. It wasn't typed. It wasn't professional. It was personal. Written warning, nursing staff member Katie Rodriguez. Documented instances of insubordination and failure to follow medical directives regarding patient in room for 12. Insubordination undermines patient care protocols and chain of command authority. The notice was laminated. The letters were emboldened. It was designed to be read. She stood there and read it. Her hand came up to touch the plastic covering, and that was when her fingers trembled, the first physical betrayal of composure her body had allowed itself. The trembling lasted 2 seconds. Then it stopped. Dr. Sterling materialized beside her like he'd been waiting around the corner for her to see it, which he probably had been. His smile was thin and sharp, a wolf showing its teeth without opening its mouth. Katie didn't acknowledge him. She turned to walk back to her station and nearly collided with Amanda, the SEAL sister, who'd been waiting by the medication dispensary with 2 cups of hospital coffee, the kind that tasted like it had been brewed the morning before yesterday. Amanda grabbed Katie's wrist gently. Her voice was low, urgent, the way people speak when they're asking a question they're terrified to ask. "Why is he doing this to you?" Katie pulled her wrist back without making it seem like a rejection. She glanced toward Dr. Sterling, who was watching them from across the unit with the intensity of a man cataloging evidence. "Because I'm looking too closely at things he once kept hidden," Katie said. The words came out barely above a whisper. It was the most honest thing she'd said in 3 years, and it cost her something to say it, not her composure, but something else. Some small piece of the false life she'd built. Amanda's eyes went wide. She was smart enough not to ask the follow-up question, and strong enough to walk away without pretending she hadn't heard what she'd just heard. The rest of Katie's shift felt like moving through water. Every chart she pulled, Dr. Sterling appeared to review her work. Every medication she administered, his shadow fell across the medication room door. Every note she typed, she could feel the pressure of his presence like humidity before a storm. The message was clear: you are being watched. You are being catalogued. You are being built a case against. She used the time productively. In the medication room, between dispensing a dilaudid drip and a versed push, she photographed 2 pages of billing records she'd already photographed with her phone 3 days ago. The images were crystal clear. Commander Hayes had been listed as receiving an experimental neuroregenerative infusion therapy on Tuesday at 1,400 hours. There was no record of it in the nursing log. No vitals associated with it. No discharge notes from the procedure. Yet Medicare had been billed $47,000 for the treatment. And there were 3 other phantoms in the same week, billing codes that corresponded to patients who didn't exist on the ward census, treatment protocols that existed only in invoices. Her stomach became very cold and very heavy, the way it becomes when you understand the scope of what you're looking at. This wasn't a medical mistake. This wasn't a paperwork error. This was systematic and deliberate and designed to harvest money from a federal system while using legitimate patients as cover. And Commander Hayes, the man who'd held her son when Marco died in Baghdad, was being used as the primary vector. That evening, Katie drove to Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in Point Loma. The sun was already dissolving into the Pacific, bleeding orange and red into the water beyond the cemetery's eastern boundary. She knew the route by heart. She'd driven it monthly for 3 years, ever since David died, the husband who'd made her disappear, the man who'd understood what it meant to carry classified secrets in your bones, the one who'd never asked her name when they met in San Diego because he already knew she wasn't allowed to have one. The headstone was granite, simple, unmarked except for dates and a name, David Michael Rodriguez, 1978 to 2021. No military rank, no unit designation, no indication of what his life had actually contained. Just a name and the before and after of his existence. Katie knelt on the wet grass. Rain was coming, she could smell it in the air, that sharp ozone charge that comes when weather is making a decision. She pressed her palm against the stone and the cold of it settled into her skin like the truth settling into her brain. "I found Marco's CO," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Commander Hayes. The man who held him in that street in Haditha when it went wrong. He's blind now, and he's in Oak Creek Memorial, and I'm the only one who understands what happened to him or why he matters." The headstone didn't answer. The wind moved through the cemetery like it was searching for something it had lost. "But I'm still buried like you said I'd have to be," Katie continued. "If I surface to help him, everything we sacrificed gets exposed. The operation, the names, the authorization that came from people I'm not supposed to remember. If I stay silent, I fail Marco all over again. And I can't," her voice cracked. One word, one small fracture in the wall she'd built. She took a breath and finished it. "I can't do that twice." Rain began to fall, light at first and then heavy, the kind of rain that comes fast and doesn't apologize. Katie didn't move. She kneeled there in the water pooling around the headstone and let it come down on her shoulders and her back and her hair, running in streams down her face so that if anyone had been watching, they wouldn't have been able to tell where the tears ended and the rain began. Her phone buzzed. A text from the chief nursing officer, "CNO wants to meet at 0800 tomorrow. Dr. Sterling made a complaint to administration. Just a heads up." She read the message 3 times. The words didn't change. But the last 48 hours suddenly crystallized into a shape she could see clearly. Dr. Sterling had decided to burn her. And what happened next would either end her or expose her, and she was no longer certain which outcome she was actually hoping for. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless frequency as Katie moved through the ICU during the morning shift, and she'd learned to recognize the precise moment Dr. Sterling entered a room without looking up from the monitors. He materialized beside her at 0630 like a shadow that had learned to walk upright, his presence making the air pressure change in ways her body registered before her mind did. She was documenting Commander Hayes' overnight vitals when she felt him there, watching the curve of her handwriting as if the pen itself might confess something. "Thorough," Dr. Sterling said. Not a compliment. The word came out like an accusation wrapped in silk. "You've been doing quite a bit of chart review lately, Nurse Rodriguez. Diving deep into the electronic records. Pulling up patient histories that don't quite concern your rotation." Katie's hand remained steady. "I review my patients' full histories, doctor. It's standard care." "Of course." He leaned against the counter, his Italian loafers catching the light. "Standard care. That's what we all do." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne mixing with the antiseptic reek of the unit, something expensive trying to mask something underneath. "Although I've noticed you've been particularly interested in some of our research protocols. The experimental treatment documentation. The pharmaceutical trials." She kept her eyes on the screen. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm like a countdown to something she couldn't yet see. "I document what I observe, doctor." "Yes. You do." He picked up a file from the counter, not one of hers, and flipped through it with deliberate slowness. "And I've noticed some very curious gaps. Patients listed in our Medicare billing system whose treatment protocols don't quite match our available records. Experimental interventions that generated significant revenue but seem to have left remarkably little clinical documentation." Katie's stomach tightened, but her voice remained level. "I haven't accessed those files." "Haven't you?" His smile was the smile of a man who'd never been told no and had decided he never would be. "That's odd. Because I've been very carefully reviewing our unit access logs. Extraordinary access, actually. Multiple midnight logins, weekend chart pulls, deep dives into the pharmaceutical procurement records." He replaced the file on the counter with precision. "By someone with a 2019 hire date and absolutely no verifiable background before that. Do you know how unusual that is, Nurse Rodriguez? How many questions that raises? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Katie's fingers remained motionless on the keyboard. She could feel the trap closing, not around her neck, but around her entire existence. Every choice she'd made to disappear, every careful erasure of Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez from every official record, every Pentagon form that had been redacted and filed away in offices without windows, he was pulling it all toward the surface like a fisherman hauling in a line. I'm reassigning your rotation effective immediately, Dr. Sterling continued, his voice taking on the texture of molten glass. You'll be covering the cardiac unit. Much less complex. More your speed, I'd imagine. Commander Hayes will be transferred to Dr. Vance's care. I'll be handling his documentation myself. You won't have access to his room or his charts. The cardiac unit is understaffed, Katie said quietly. Commander Hayes needs continuity. Commander Hayes needs to be away from someone with her credentials under review. Dr. Sterling straightened, and his shadow fell across the monitor like a curtain closing. I've already spoken with Patricia Walsh and the credentialing committee. They have some very serious questions about your licensure. Very serious indeed. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the confidence of a man who'd already won. Katie sat motionless at the workstation, her hands folded in her lap, forcing her breathing to remain even while her mind ran through the architecture of her own destruction. He wasn't wrong. Every single thing he'd said was built on a foundation of truth he didn't understand, the classified files, the redacted service jacket, the fact that she literally did not exist in any database before 2019 because the woman she'd been before that moment had been excised from recorded history with the precision of a surgical scalpel. The next morning, Katie arrived for her shift and found a printed memo taped to her locker, effective immediately, all unit assignments modified per credentialing review. Kate Rodriguez assigned to Cardiac Unit 0700 to 1900 shift. The tape was fresh and aggressive, the kind of tape used by someone who wanted the message to stay put. She changed into her scrubs in the empty locker room, her fingers running over the worn leather of her combat boots, the Oakley assault boots she'd worn during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the one she kept laced but untouched in the back of her locker like a prayer she couldn't afford to pray. The rubber toe was scuffed from the Haditha extraction. The left boot had a small blood stain on the heel that wouldn't come out, even after 17 years. She ran her thumb over it and didn't cry. The cardiac unit was indeed understaffed. 3 nurses for 12 beds, all of them scattered thin as tissue paper. Katie moved through the shift with mechanical precision, checking ports, adjusting medications, running EKGs on patients whose names she'd never see again after her shift ended. Every 2 hours, she found an excuse to walk past the ICU on her route to the lab. She'd catch glimpses of the unit through the glass, Commander Hayes in room for 12, a new nurse checking his monitors, Dr. Sterling reviewing charts with the focused intensity of a man constructing a narrative. At 14:30, Katie was restocking the crash cart on Cardiac when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like an apparition that refused to stay buried. Patricia Walsh was with him, the chief nursing officer, her expression caught between sympathy and institutional obligation. "We need to discuss your preliminary credentialing findings," Patricia said, and her voice had the careful texture of someone reading from a script she'd been handed. "Dr. Sterling has raised several concerns about the accuracy of your background documentation. Your hiring file shows nursing school graduation in 2019, but 0 prior employment history. No residency in any state database prior to that date. It's as if you didn't exist before you walked through our doors." Katie remained silent. There was no defense to this accusation that didn't require her entire buried past to surface like a body that wouldn't stay submerged. "There's also the matter of your unusual access patterns," Patricia continued, her fingers turning a folder over in her hands. "Chart reviews outside your unit. Attention to our billing protocols. Dr. Sterling has documented a pattern of behavior that suggests you may be investigating something rather than simply providing patient care." "I review my patients' histories," Katie said quietly. "I document what I observe." "Of course you do. Patricia's sigh carried the weight of institutional machinery grinding into motion. "We're going to need to suspend your unit access pending a full background verification. You'll be assigned to administrative duties while the State Nursing Board conducts a review. Dr. Sterling has filed a complaint about possible insubordination and failure to follow medical directives. We're taking this very seriously." After they left, Katie sat on the edge of the crash cart and didn't move for 3 minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed above like the white noise of bureaucratic processes that would eventually consume her. She'd spent 17 years building a life that was only ever meant to be temporary: a nursing license, a small house, a husband who'd asked no questions and demanded no answers. She'd thought the erasure would protect her. She'd thought disappearing was the same as being safe. What she hadn't counted on was a man like Dr. Sterling who had the resources and the motivation to notice that the safest person in any room was usually the one with the most to hide. That evening, Katie sat in the break room during her 30-minute window and watched the other nurses. There were 5 of them: Margaret, who'd worked cardiac for 12 years, Devon, who'd trained her, Thomas, who'd always saved her a piece of birthday cake, and 2 newer nurses Katie had eaten lunch with twice. When Katie sat at the table with her sandwich, there was a pause in conversation. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just the subtle shift that happens when the air changes. Margaret stood first. "I need to check on 412, she said, though room for 12 was in the ICU and she worked cardiac. The others followed her, their chairs scraping against the linoleum with the sound of dominoes falling. Devon didn't meet her eyes. Thomas was suddenly very interested in his phone. Katie ate her sandwich alone and didn't look up. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the vending machine hummed its mechanical song, and somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarmed and someone answered it. She thought about how carefully you could construct an entire life and how quickly it could be disassembled by a man who saw only what he wanted to see and understood nothing of what he was actually looking at. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The morning meeting convened at 6:45 before the day's shift officially began. Dr. Sterling sat across from CNO Patricia Walsh in her corner office overlooking the hospital's main entrance, the city of San Diego still wrapped in gray pre-dawn light. He'd rehearsed this for 3 days, watching her calendar until he found a window when she'd be alone. The folder lay open on her desk, and Katie Rodriguez's name appeared on every fabricated document inside it. Missed vital signs. Improper medication documentation. Unauthorized patient access. Each charge was constructed with enough technical language to sound credible, assembled by someone who understood hospital systems well enough to weaponize them. Dr. Sterling leaned forward with the expression of a man bearing difficult truths about a troubled employee. "The patterns escalated," he said, his voice carrying the particular timbre of regret. "She's become unstable since the reassignment. Obsessive documentation. Unauthorized room entries. Yesterday she violated the unit restriction I personally imposed." Walsh studied the papers, her brow tightening. "Have you reported this formally?" "That's why I came to you first," Sterling replied, his smile calculated. "Before it becomes a legal matter. 3 board members have already discussed her: Bancroft, Hammond, and Dr. Pierce. They're concerned about liability exposure if we don't move decisively." The names landed like precision strikes. Bancroft controlled the hospital's malpractice insurance. Hammond sat on the credentialing committee. Pierce was close to the hospital administrator. Walsh closed the folder. "I'll need to review the documentation properly." Sterling was already standing. "Of course. But between you and me, Patricia, we need to move quickly. If there's another incident and we haven't documented our concerns, the hospital becomes negligent." By 7:30, he'd called all 3 board members. Not requests. Statements of fact wrapped in language about duty and institutional protection. Bancroft listened without interrupting. Hammond promised to flag her file. Pierce said he'd reach out to the administrator directly. They played golf together on Thursdays. Sterling had built his power the way men like him always did, through favors accumulated like currency, through relationships that ran deeper than any single patient or any single nurse. The written warning appeared on the unit board at 8:15, posted in the break room where every staff member would see it during their shift. Katie's name printed in clinical sans serif font, the accusation formatted in official hospital letterhead that made everything sound true. Insubordination. Failure to follow medical directives. Unauthorized patient contact outside assigned parameters. The warning was effective immediately. No meeting. No hearing. Just a document that would follow her into every room she entered, a scarlet letter written in bureaucratic language. Nurses glanced at it and then away, the same way they'd learned to look away from her. Maya Santos, a respiratory therapist who'd once grabbed coffee with Katie every Thursday, suddenly needed to recheck the oxygen flow rates in the hallway rather than make eye contact. The isolation had moved beyond social, it was now institutional, sealed with the hospital's official stamp. Katie stood in front of the break room bulletin board for exactly 4 seconds. She read her name. She read the charges. She felt the weight of every eye in the unit avoiding hers. Then she turned and walked to room for 12, where she had no authorization to be. Commander Hayes sat in the morning light filtering through half-drawn curtains, his blind eyes fixed on a point beyond the window. His vitals had been stable through the night, but his chest wall remained rigid, his breathing shallow and guarded. Katie had reviewed his imaging 3 times now. The rib fractures weren't fully catalogued in his chart, one small fracture on the right side notated only in passing. The missed rib was the kind of detail that happened in trauma. The obvious injuries commanded attention while the subtle ones hid in the background. She stood in his doorway. Not at his bedside. Staying in the territory where an observer might think she was simply passing through. "Morning, sir," she said quietly. "How's the pain?" His head turned toward her voice. "You're not supposed to be here." It wasn't a question. "No, sir. I'm not." She stayed in the doorway. "But your chest wall is guarding on the right side. There's a rib fracture in your imaging that hasn't been addressed in your treatment plan. Below the line of the obvious breaks. When pneumothorax develops, it won't announce itself like the first one." Hayes went absolutely still. "How do you know that?" "Because I was trained to see what other people miss, sir. And because I know what it looks like when someone's about to die, and I can see it coming." She didn't enter the room. She simply stated the facts as she would to a fellow operator, the way she'd been trained to deliver intelligence under fire, clear, specific, without embellishment. Hayes's fingers gripped the bedsheet. "If you're here, if you're saying this now, then you know something you shouldn't know." "Yes, sir." "And you're telling me anyway." "Yes, sir." The silence held between them like a held breath, the kind that comes just before something breaks. She could hear the heart monitor's rhythmic beep, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze in the next bed over, the fluorescent lights humming their constant frequency overhead. "Thank you," he said finally. Katie turned and left room for 12. She had 15 minutes before the shift supervisor noticed she'd violated her reassignment. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the ICU descended into that strange quiet that comes only in the deep hours, the skeleton crew moving through dimmed corridors, families asleep in waiting rooms, the outside world temporarily forgotten. Katie was at the nursing station charting, her shift officially ending at 7, when the monitor in room for 12 began its cascade of alarms. Not a single beep. A symphony of warning. The heart rate climbing past 140. The oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, 94, 88, 79, 71. Dr. Reeves, the on-call resident, appeared from the call room looking confused, fumbling for his stethoscope as he walked toward the room. Katie was already moving. She grabbed the emergency kit from the wall, her hand steady as water, muscle memory overriding everything that came after service. The years in intensive care were borrowed muscle memory, the years before that were the real thing. Her hands knew what to do. Commander Hayes's chest wall was caving inward, the pressure building in his right pleural space with nowhere to go. Classic tension pneumothorax, not the first one, but the second fracture presenting exactly as she'd predicted. His oxygen saturation hit 62. Reeves was still in the doorway looking at the monitor. "Move," Katie said, not asked. She was already positioning the needle, finding the anatomical landmarks by feel the way you do when your fingers have learned the human body the way a violinist learns an instrument. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The 14-gauge angiocath needle held between her fingers like a surgeon's tool, not a piece of equipment. She didn't wait for permission or for the resident to understand. She pushed the needle through the chest wall, through the pleura, into the pressurized space beyond. The hiss of air escaping. That sound, the sudden release of pressure, was the sound of a man not dying. "Get a chest tube set up," she said to the nurse who'd appeared in the doorway. "Call Dr. Sterling. Tell him we have a spontaneous secondary pneumothorax secondary to occult rib fracture." The oxygen saturation began climbing immediately. 62 became 70. 70 became 85. Commander Hayes's breathing eased, his rigid chest wall finally allowing air to move. Reeves stood frozen, watching someone he'd never seen move with such certainty accomplish a procedure with the kind of precision that came from having done it before, many times before, under conditions that would have broken most people. Katie pulled the needle out cleanly, already reaching for the chest tube setup. Her movements were economical, efficient, the kind of motion that comes from training that goes deeper than any curriculum. She'd done this in field houses. She'd done this by firelight. She'd done this while people died around her and still saved the ones who needed saving. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2:27, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He looked at the monitor. He looked at Commander Hayes, whose oxygen was now stable at 94%. He looked at Katie, who was securing the chest tube with methodical tape work while the air hissed steadily into the collection chamber. He said nothing. Just turned and left the room. By 6 o'clock, the network was activated. 3 phone calls to board members, each one a reminder of obligations. A second complaint filed with the State Nursing Board, this one detailing medication errors that had never occurred, constructed with enough medical language to pass initial review. An investigator digging into Katie Rodriguez's background with new urgency, pulling records that didn't exist, finding the gaps in her history where 17 years had been redacted and classified. At noon, security guard Marcus Williams appeared at the nursing station with a cardboard box. His face was the expression of a man asked to do something he hated. "Ms. Rodriguez." His voice was quiet. "I'm sorry. I've been instructed to escort you out." She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply packed her things with the same efficiency she'd shown at the needle decompression. Her stethoscope. A photograph of Marco in his navy dress uniform, his face young and alive. The battered pair of combat boots from her locker, the one she'd worn during the Haditha extraction in 2008, back when Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez existed in official records and not just in redacted files. Nurses averted their eyes as Marcus walked her through the ICU. She passed room for 12. Commander Hayes's door was closed, but his sister Amanda stood in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. "He's asking for you," Amanda whispered. "He keeps saying a word over and over, phantom. Does that mean anything to you?" Katie's face went pale. She kept walking. That evening she stood in the rain at David's grave at Fort Rosecrans, water mixing with tears as her fingers traced the letters of his name on the stone. "I found Marco's CO, David," she whispered to the granite marker and the darkness beyond it. "The man who held him when he died in Baghdad, and I couldn't even help him because I'm still buried like you told me I'd have to be. I failed them both." The boots sat beside her in the mud, ghosts of a life she couldn't claim, and somewhere in the city behind her, a blind Navy SEAL was asking for a name that nobody there was allowed to speak. Dr. Sterling arrived 10 minutes later, his shoes clicking against the tile with the precision of a metronome. The code had been called. The crisis had passed. And Katie Rodriguez was standing in the corner of room for 12 with her glove still wet, her needle decompression kit on the bedside table, the evidence of her unauthorized intervention spread across the medical field like a confession written in steel and plastic. He saw the needle. He saw the O2 saturation climbing on the monitor, from 68 to 88 to 94. He saw Commander Hayes breathing without the rattling sound of a collapsing lung, and his jaw tightened in a way that made the muscles along his neck stand out like rope. He didn't look at Katie. He didn't have to. The absence of the on-call resident, the precision of the decompression site, the way the vital signs had stabilized, all of it pointed to one person. One person he'd already made a plan to destroy. "Step away from the patient," Sterling said. His voice was ice. "Now." Katie moved. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't meet his eyes. She simply peeled off her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard receptacle, and waited. The fluorescent lights above Commander Hayes hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to the power struggle happening beneath them. Sterling moved to the bedside, his eye scanning the chart, reading the notations Katie had made in her precise handwriting. Needle decompression. Time. Response. All the documentation of a save that wasn't supposed to happen. The phone call started at 6 a.m., before the sun had fully cleared the Pacific horizon. Sterling sat in his office, the door locked, the minibar open, and his Rolodex, yes, he still kept a physical Rolodex, like a man from another era, spread across his mahogany desk. 3 board members. Each one owed him something. A favorable recommendation for their son's medical school application. A silent agreement not to audit certain grant allocations. A subscription to his research seminars, which were little more than excuses to funnel Medicare money into offshore accounts. He knew their weaknesses. He knew their hunger. He knew exactly how to activate them. The board member who answered first was Bancroft, the chief of orthopedics, whose daughter had been arrested for possession. "Dr. Bancroft," Sterling said, his voice smooth as silk, "I need the nursing board contact at the state level. Someone who listens. Someone who understands that protocol violations in our ICU have become a serious liability issue." The lie went down easy. Bancroft made 3 calls by 6:22 a.m. By 7 o'clock, a state nursing board investigator named Hendricks had a file on her desk with fabricated concerns about Katie's credentialing, her background check, her suspicious gaps in employment history. Where was she from 2015 to 2019? Why did her record start in 2019 with no prior work history? Why was her background so clean it almost looked redacted? The third call was to a private investigator named Cortez, a man who asked no questions and who had, over the years, found plenty of people who didn't exist on paper. "Find me everything that woman is hiding," Sterling said. "I don't care what it costs." Military background. Black Ops. Government contracts. Whatever keeps her record sealed. By 9 a.m., Katie was being called into HR. Not fired. Not yet. That would come later, after Sterling had built the case, after he'd created enough paper trail that no lawyer could save her. This was just a conversation. A formality. The HR director, a nervous woman named Chen, had a termination letter already prepared, but Sterling had instructed her to wait. Let it sink in first. Let the anxiety do the work. The security guard's name was Marcus Williams. 22 years of service at Oak Creek Memorial. He'd walked Katie out of the building 100 times. He knew her. He knew her work. He'd seen her give a blood transfusion to a homeless man who had no insurance, seen her sit beside a dying cancer patient at 3 a.m. just to hold her hand. And now he had to walk her to the door with her belongings in a cardboard box, the same kind of box Sterling had ordered prepared with theatrical precision. Inside the box were her personal effects. A framed photo of Marco in his navy dress blues. A handwritten note from a patient whose daughter had been saved by Katie's quick thinking. And at the bottom, wrapped in newspaper like ancient artifacts, were her combat boots. They were worn. The leather was creased and weathered, the laces frayed, the sole scuffed in ways that told stories only she could read. The left boot had a small burn mark from an IED blast near Haditha in 2006. The right boot had dried blood that had never quite washed out, someone else's blood, someone whose name was classified and whose death she still carried like a stone in her chest. "Katie," Marcus said, and his voice had that particular quality of a man trying not to cry. This isn't right. Everyone knows it isn't right. Then document it, Katie said. Her voice hadn't changed. Her composure hadn't cracked. And move on. She walked across the parking lot in the noon sun, the cardboard box heavy against her hip, her shadow stretching long across the asphalt. She didn't run. She didn't stumble. She looked, to anyone watching, like a woman leaving a job, not like she was burying herself again. That evening, she drove to Fort Rosecrans. The rain had started around 5 p.m., one of those San Diego coastal rains that felt personal, aimed, like the sky itself was mourning. Katie's husband David had been buried there for 14 years. She hadn't visited his grave in 3 years, couldn't risk the emotional breakdown, couldn't risk someone seeing the senior chief break down at a cemetery in a military town where people paid attention to uniforms and decorations and the things that didn't add up about people. She knelt in the mud. The rain soaked through her scrubs, through her jacket, cold and relentless. She touched his headstone, her fingers tracing his name the way she used to trace the scar tissue on his back from the IED that took half his left arm. I found him, David, she said. Her voice was steady, but it was costing her everything. I found Marco's CO. The man who held our son when he died. Commander Hayes. He came into my ICU, and he was blind and helpless, and I could have saved him. I could have held him the way he held Marco. But I couldn't. Because I'm still buried. Because my service was classified so deep that even a Navy SEAL doesn't know who pulled him out of Haditha when the official rescue was abandoned. I had to let him go. I chose the secret over the man. And now I've lost everything. I'm so sorry, David. I'm so sorry. She sat in the rain for an hour. The water pooled around her knees. The boots, David's boots, really, the pair he'd left her before he deployed the final time, were mud-caked and history-heavy in her mind. She drove home in silence. 48 hours. That was the ticking clock. 48 hours between termination and everything breaking open. Katie was standing at the HR desk collecting her final check, making it official, when the first alarm shrieked from the ICU. 3 tones. High-pitched. Continuous. Code blue. The words came over the intercom like a prayer in reverse. Room for 12. Commander Hayes. She heard the running footsteps. She heard the crash cart being wheeled at speed. She heard the controlled chaos of code protocol, voices calling out compressions, drug doses, rhythm checks. And then she heard someone shouting her name. Not her fake name. Not the nurse name. Her actual name, echoing down the hallway like a ghost-made sound. Katie moved before she thought. Years of training took over. Muscle memory. The same neural pathways that had guided her hands through 17 hostage extractions in a city that had turned to ash around her. She was in room for 12 before anyone could stop her. She was holding pressure on Commander Hayes' chest wound, her hands moving with surgical precision, her jaw clenched tight. The blind man's eyes, those scarred, sightless eyes, turned toward her voice. His hand found her wrist in the chaos. His fingers squeezed. Phantom, he whispered. Just one word. The code name. The operation. The impossible made real. The room went dead silent. Even the monitors seemed to pause. Then the door opened. Marco stood in the threshold wearing navy dress blues, and he was crying, and he was very much alive. That senior chief petty officer Rodriguez, sir, he said, his voice cracking like thunder. The room erupted. A SEAL team leader stepped forward, the kind of man who carries authority in his shoulders. His voice was ceremonial, official, speaking into a silence so thick you could operate in it. Navy Cross, he said. The men around the bed straightened. A Navy Cross. The highest award for valor. 2 silver stars. Reactions. Nods. Salutes. Purple heart. And a second purple heart. The decorations piled up, each one a weight, each one a story they'd never heard and never would. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez extracted 17 hostages from Haditha when the official rescue was abandoned. She went back in after the perimeter collapsed. She brought out then Lieutenant Hayes when he was too wounded to move. She did it classified. She did it in darkness. She did it knowing she'd never be acknowledged in public. 2 FBI agents entered the room. Their badges caught the fluorescent light. Dr. Sterling's fraud investigation, one of them said, was triggered by careful charting discrepancies. Billing anomalies. Medicare fraud totaling $847,000 over 4 years. Your documentation, Senior Chief, was the evidence we needed. Marcus Williams walked in carrying a cardboard box. It was identical to the one Katie had carried out 48 hours earlier. He handed it to Dr. Sterling, who'd appeared in the doorway white-faced and hollow. The security guard's voice was flat, professional, the same voice he'd used for her. I believe you know the way out, sir. 6 months later, Katie wore a uniform again. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. Head trauma nurse at the VA San Diego, her office walls lined with photos. Marco in his SEAL training gear, the trident on his chest earned fair. Commander Hayes with his service dog, his vision partially restored, enough to see shapes and shadows and the faces of the people who mattered. David's memorial flag, folded into a triangle, holding the space for the husband who told her to stay buried until she was needed. She drove past a strip mall on Midway Drive one afternoon. Through the window of a discount insurance office, she saw Dr. Sterling at a folding table. His suit was generic now. His watch was gone. An elderly woman was asking him about coverage limits, and his voice had none of the arrogance it used to carry. It sounded like sand. It sounded like nothing. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His dropped first. Katie drove on without slowing down. That evening, she visited David's grave one final time in dress uniform, her boots polished parade ready. She knelt and touched his headstone. I kept my promise, David. I stayed buried until the moment I was needed most. Marco's alive. Commander Hayes is healing. And I finally got to surface again. She stood. She saluted the grave. She walked away as the sun set over Fort Rosecrans, painting the sky the color of old blood. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've made it this far, you know that speaking up against corruption, even when it costs you everything, is how real change happens. If you've experienced something similar, if you've stood between what's right and what's safe, comment below. Share this story. Subscribe for more accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when nobody was watching. Because the world needs to know, the quiet ones are often the ones holding it all together.